Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today in defense of what in essence is the very essence of our democracy and the voting rights of all Americans. Our dear friend, someone who I had the privilege of serving with in the House of Representatives, the late John Lewis, took a beating on a bridge in Selma for the right to vote. Surely we in the Senate can muster a shred of his courage to protect that right. There are no other rights without the right to vote. It is through the right to vote that freedom rings, that justice reigns, and opportunity arises. As we all know, this Monday was Dr. Martin Luther King Day, and we have to remember his words. He said, quote, "The vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by human beings for breaking down injustice and destroying the terrible walls which imprison people because they are different from others." That's what he called the right to vote, humanity's greatest instrument for advancing progress. Well, the time has come for us to defend it. Now, my colleagues who oppose our voting rights legislation have had ample time to make their opinions heard. Soon it will be time to end debate and hold a simple up or down vote on the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Advancement Act. After all, the state legislatures passing voter suppression laws across the country are doing so with simple majorities. Conservative majorities that in many cases were born out of decades of partisan gerrymandering. And how about the Supreme Court? It was a simple majority vote of 5-4 that gutted the Voting Rights Act. That was the law that John Lewis and others risked their lives for on Bloody Sunday. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended discriminatory tactics that not only blocked black voters from their ballots, but other minorities too, including Latinos. Shortly after the Civil War, Latinos held greater political power in states like California, Texas, Arizona. But as Jim Crow spread throughout the South, they were pushed out of elected positions and threatened with violence for their continued participation. The Voting Rights Act transformed our country for the better. It created the diverse, multiracial democracy we live in today. And I know that my story, the son of first-generation refugees who came from nothing and rose to become one of 100 United States senators in a nation of 350 million people, is only possible because of the civil rights giants who came before me. The Voting Rights Act ended Jim Crow-era voting laws, and its preclearance provision stopped states from resurrecting them in the future. States and localities with ugly histories of discrimination had to get preclearance from the Justice Department before tampering with their voting laws. Yet in 2013, the Supreme Court's 5-4 ruling in Shelby County essentially said that racial progress rendered the need for this oversight obsolete. Obsolete. As if racism no longer exists in this country. The late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said it best. She said, ending preclearance when it is continuing to, quote, stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. Indeed, that ruling opened the floodgates for new voter suppression laws. My colleague from New Jersey often cited Texas. Texas, home to millions of black and Latino voters, resurrected a strict photo ID law that had been struck down just the year before. Then North Carolina slashed early voting and ended same-day registration with a law that the Fourth Circuit found was, quote, intentionally written to disenfranchise black voters. and other states like Alabama started reducing polling locations in minority communities. These measures may not look like poll taxes or literacy tests, but they are the tools of oppression just the same. Their intent is the same, to depress turnout among minority voters, and they threaten the promise of our vibrant multiracial democracy. Now, throughout this debate, I've tried to sit here several hours. I've heard our Republican colleagues question, well, why after record turnouts in the last presidential election would we feel the need to revisit voting rights legislation? Well, the answer is pretty simple. If Republicans systematically were not tearing down the laws that gave rise to the record turnouts, then maybe this wouldn't be necessary. But that's exactly what they have done in state after state. Voting rights used to enjoy broad bipartisan support here in the Senate. Indeed, Republicans and Democrats stood together for decades to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, most recently in 2006. In fact, I want to quote one of my colleagues on the day of the last reauthorization. He said, quote, "America's history is a story of ever-increasing freedom, hope, and opportunity for all. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 represents one of this country's greatest steps forward in that story. Every American must have freedom of political expression, including the free, unfettered right to vote," close quote. Those words were Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who spoke those words on that day. He was one of 16 Republicans who proudly voted for the 2006 reauthorization, but stand in the way today. 16 Republicans who still are present in the United States Senate, including not only he, but Senators Grassley, Shelby, Crapo, Collins, Burr, Inhofe, Graham, Thune, Cornyn, Blackburn, Blunt, Boozman, Capito, Moran, and Wicker. That's right. 16 Republicans who supported the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act still serve in this body today. So to them I say, join us. Join us. What's changed? What was right then is clearly right now. Join us, and we could pass the Voting Rights Advancement Act with a bipartisan supermajority, no change of the rules necessary. Just join us as you did in 2006. But we know that won't happen. Not today, not since our democracy has been flooded by a torrential downpour of lies. Earlier this month, we observed the one-year anniversary of the January 6th insurrection. A defeated president's violent mob nearly overturned a free and verifiably fair election and tried to overthrow the U.S. Constitution. Shots rang out in the Capitol. The Confederate flag waved through its hallowed halls. That never even happened during the Civil War. A New Jerseyan and Capitol police officer named Brian Sicknick was drenched in bear spray and later died. Imagine using a toxic substance intended to fend off bear attacks on a fellow human beings, beating officers within inches of death, inflicting such painful trauma that multiple officers have since ended their own lives. All because one man could not accept defeat. A man with an ego so big, he could not fathom losing by 7 million votes. An ego so big, he manufactured a lie to match it. A lie so big, it inspired violence and nearly brought down the Constitution. That lie should have died within minutes of the former president speaking it. Instead, it lived. The big lie lived to grow even bigger, thanks to a Republican Party that is no longer a party, I believe, of principle, but a party of fealty to a wannabe despot. Since the insurrection, the most anti-democratic laws since Jim Crow have taken the nation by storm. Last year, 19 states passed nearly 3 dozen laws undermining access to the ballot box. It is as if they're trying to codify the big lie into law. In Arizona, Georgia, and other states, they've made it harder to vote by mail, something that my colleagues have talked about, that Americans have been doing for decades, and the Republican GOP efforts one time long embraced it as a way to succeed. They're also removing drop boxes in minority communities under the bogus claim that they invite fraud. So when it's in Reverend Warnock's community, or Senator Padilla's community, or Cory Booker's community, or my community, somehow that drop box invites fraud just simply because it's in our community? Another lie straight from the mouth of a defeated president. And many states are reducing early voting days. When you add up all these restrictions, what do you get? Longer lines at the polls, people giving up. Folks who have to get home to their kids, workers who can't afford to take a day off. To the partisan architects of these laws, their sighs of resignation, that's music to their ears. They want to make voting so inconvenient for working people and communities of color that they don't even bother. The Georgia state legislature gave itself the power to remove election officials that were elected by the people if they don't like what they see. Simply put, these laws gave state legislators new tools to disregard the will of the voters. So I've come to the conclusion that since Republicans cannot win elections with the power of their ideas, they're doing everything they can to change the rules of the game so they can win anyway. In doing so, they are taking us back to a time and place where injustice prevailed, a time and a place that I certainly don't want to go back to, nor do I want my children or grandchildren to go back to, or those who I represent to go back to. Finally, as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I would note that when we see an attempted coup or creeping authoritarianism abroad, we call it democratic backsliding. Now, other countries are wondering, is that happening to the United States? Dictators around the world are jumping for joy. This is what they want to see: democracy in disarray. In fact, last November, the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance added the United States to a list of backsliding democracies for the first time ever. Look, democratic self-government only works when all parties consent to be governed by whoever wins the most votes. That's how elections work. We can debate the corporate tax rate, we can disagree about financial aid funding, we can differ over health care policy, but the outcome of a fair and free election, the sanctity of the right to vote, these are not up for debate. Voting rights are the foundation of this entire democratic enterprise, this great American experiment. It's time every senator looks into their soul and decides how they want to be remembered when future generations remember this perilous moment in our history. This legislation will protect the rights of all of our voters, young and old, rich and poor, black and white, Latino and Asian, indigenous, immigrant, Republican, Democrat, independent, the single mom, exhausted but relieved her neighbor could watch the kids so she could make it to the polls, the warehouse worker who can't afford a day off but winds up taking one anyway, the elderly African-American woman, her hands shaking with determination as she signs her name on a mail-in ballot. She remembers life before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and she will never forget the sacrifices of those who marched for it, who bled for it, and even died for the right to vote. Now, I'll just say the final thing. We all take an oath to the Constitution. It's required under the Constitution to be sworn in as a member of Congress. And in that Constitution, an amendment that is seen only as it relates to a different time in history, but is very clear and very powerful. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. These rights enshrined in the Constitution under the 15th Amendment, they are certainly being abridged. They are certainly being affected in a way that we could not fathom in the year 2022. How shameful it would be if we let it slip through our fingers and be buried under an avalanche of one sore loser's lies. How shameful it would be to violate our oath to the Constitution, to that 15th Amendment, in order to preserve some rule that is not in the Constitution and certainly is not as enshrined as that right to vote. I hope that those who joined us in 2006 will be there today to vote with us on the Republican side. And if that fails, then I hope we will change the filibuster into a talking filibuster so the nation can see who stands on the side of ensuring the franchise of that right to vote for every American. I yield the floor.